The first time Evelyn Harper realized her son no longer saw her as a mother. The revelation did not come through a sharp word or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived with the cold, metallic click of a heavy brass deadbolt being drilled directly into the exterior of her bedroom door. It happened quietly, almost politely, in the very dead of a storm-drenched October evening in rural Tennessee. Outside, the autumn rain did not merely fall. It hammered against the panes of the old, sprawling farmhouse with a relentless, punishing fury. This was the house her late husband, Walter, had built with his own calloused hands 40 years ago. Every joist, every floorboard, every piece of crown molding had been placed with a quiet, enduring love. Now, those same walls felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully constructed tomb. Evelyn was 76 years old, trapped in the agonizing, sluggish limbo of recovering from extensive hip surgery. A sudden, catastrophic fall 3 months prior had shattered her independence, leaving her weak, frail, and entirely confined to a heavy, squeaking wheelchair. It was a devastating blow for a woman who had spent her entire life tending to others, baking for the church, and walking the perimeter of their 12-acre property. When the hospital discharged her, her son, Ryan, had insisted with intense, urgent gravity that she move her bedroom downstairs to the small parlor room adjacent to the kitchen. "It's strictly for safety, Mom," he had said, his voice smooth, reasonable, and laced with an algorithmic kind of concern. "We just can't risk you trying to navigate those steep stairs again. Let us take care of you now. You've earned it." Beside him stood his girlfriend, Candace. Whenever neighbors from the surrounding valley dropped by to check on the matriarch of Pine Ridge, Candace would offer a dazzling, performative smile. She would glide into Evelyn's room carrying steaming bowls of homemade soup, adjusting the pillows with practiced grace, and calling her Mama Eve in a high, sweet, rehearsed affection that never failed to charm the visitors. "We just adore having her down here where we can keep an eye on her," Candace would tell the pastor, her hand resting gently on Ryan's shoulder. "She's our absolute world." But kindness performed solely for witnesses always evaporates the exact second the front door clicks shut. As the autumn deep freeze began to set in, rolling off the smoky ridges of the mountains, Evelyn came to understand a terrible, suffocating truth that chilled her far more than the mountain wind. Ryan and Candace were not caring for her. They were actively, methodically waiting for her to die. The farmhouse and the 12 pristine acres of rolling green land it sat upon were suddenly worth nearly $1 million. A massive, luxury resort corporation had recently announced plans to develop a multi-million-dollar golf and spa retreat on the adjacent property, making the Harper estate the crown jewel of the valley. To Walter, this land had been a sacred trust. He was a quiet Vietnam veteran who had returned from the horrors of war with deep scars, finding his healing in the soil. He had spent his decades building sturdy cedar fences, repairing rusted tractors, and planting rows of delicate peach trees beside the rushing creek that snaked behind the house. Before the cancer finally took him, Walter had held Evelyn's fragile hand in the hospital room, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Evie, promise me, don't you ever sell the place unless you truly want to. Don't let anyone push you off our dirt." But Ryan didn't care about his father's ghost, nor did he care about the sweat equity poured into the soil. He wanted the payout, and he wanted it immediately. At first, the psychological pressure applied to Evelyn sounded entirely harmless, wrapped in the deceptive language of filial duty. "Mom, look at your hands. You can barely manage to hold a teacup, let alone manage a historic property like this," Ryan would say during dinner, his eyes locked onto his phone, tracking market values. "You really should just sign the deed transfer over to us now." Evelyn, Before the state taxes get worse and eat up whatever inheritance you have left, Candace would chime in, her voice dropping the sweet Mama Eve moniker the moment they were alone. We're only trying to help you avoid probate. We're protecting you. But as the weeks bled into a gray, frozen November, Evelyn's quiet, stubborn refusal to sign the paperwork caused the masks to completely slip. The performative warmth hardened into a calculated, systemic cruelty. It started with the medication. Candace, who worked at a small, cluttered insurance office in Knoxville, took complete control of Evelyn's prescriptions. Soon, she began forgetting to refill the vital pain pills for days at a time. When Evelyn's hip would throb with fire in the middle of the night, leaving her weeping in the dark, Candace would merely shrug the next morning. The pharmacy is backed up. Evelyn, you'll just have to offer it up and offer us some cooperation if you want things to run smoothly around here. Then came the digital isolation. Ryan systematically disconnected the house's traditional landline phone, claiming it was a useless expense and that she was calling too many random people and getting confused by telemarketers. They walked through the living room like thieves, removing the beautifully framed black and white family photos of Walter, Evelyn, and Ryan as a child, replacing them with cold, expensive, modern minimalist furniture that Evelyn utterly loathed. Every single anchor she had to her past, to her identity, and to her dignity was being systematically cut away. She was being erased in her own home, trapped in a body that refused to heal, listening to the muffled laughter of her son and his lover through the thick oak door. A door that now locked from the outside every single night at precisely 8 o'clock. By the time the brutal winter of December and January firmly gripped rural Tennessee, Evelyn felt like a ghost haunting the margins of her own life. The isolation was no longer a byproduct of her physical infirmity. It was a weaponized strategy. When Mrs. Delaney, her next-door neighbor of nearly 35 years, stopped by on a biting Sunday afternoon with a warm, tin-foil-wrapped loaf of fresh banana bread, Evelyn's heart leapt in her chest sitting in her wheelchair in the dim light of the parlor. She heard the heavy thud of the front door knocker. She heard Mrs. Delaney's familiar, comforting southern drawl asking how Evelyn was holding up. Evelyn opened her mouth to scream, to call out to her dearest friend. But before she could make a sound, the door to her bedroom was violently, silently pulled shut from the outside. In the hallway, Candace answered the front door, her face instantly morphing into that radiant, tragic smile she reserved for the public. "Oh, Mrs. Delaney, you are just an angel," Candace whispered loudly, her voice dripping with a heavy, performative exhaustion. "But Evelyn is sleeping right now. To be completely honest with you, the new medication the doctor put her on just tires her out completely. Some days, she doesn't even recognize us. It's just breaking Ryan's heart." "Oh, the poor dear," Mrs. Delaney sighed, her voice heavy with sympathy. "Well, you just give her my love. Candace, you kids are doing a wonderful job taking care of her. It takes special saints to do what you do." "We do it gladly," Candace said softly. Inside the darkened room, Evelyn sat frozen in her wheelchair, a solitary, scalding tear cutting a path through the deep wrinkles of her cheek. She listened helplessly as the front door clicked shut, followed by the crunch of Mrs. Delaney's boots walking down the graveled driveway. The sheer helplessness was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. They were convincing the world she was losing her mind, laying the groundwork so that when she finally vanished, no one would ask a single question. As January drifted into a bleak, icy February, the cruelty evolved from psychological torture into something far more sinister. It began with the arrival of a thick, official-looking insurance packet in the mail, which Candace quickly snatched from the counter. What Ryan and Candace didn't realize was that Evelyn, despite her failing body, possessed a mind that remained as sharp and clear as a winter bell. She observed everything. She noticed how Ryan's nervous energy escalated into a frenzied, desperate greed. She overheard fragments of late-night arguments through the walls, whispers about mounting credit card debts, failed investments, and the urgent, desperate need for immediate liquidation. Ryan had secretly, using forged digital signatures and stolen legal documents, massively increased Evelyn's accidental death insurance coverage. Candace's position at the insurance firm in Knoxville gave her the precise, dangerous knowledge required to manipulate the system, bypass standard verifications, and structure a policy that would yield a staggering payday in the event of a fatal mishap. To her own flesh and blood, Evelyn was no longer a mother, a storyteller, or the woman who had stayed awake for nights on end rocking him through childhood fevers. She was a massive liability blocking a $1 million payday. She was nothing more than money trapped inside a failing, 76-year-old body. One incredibly icy February night, Evelyn went to wheel herself from the small vanity back to her bed. As she gripped the metal rims of her wheelchair, she noticed a strange, loose sensation in the mechanism. When she engaged the handbrakes to steady herself for the transfer to the mattress, the right lever gave way entirely with a sickening, slack snap. The chair lurched violently backward, nearly throwing her onto the hardwood floor. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear, raw and primal, crawled into her stomach and coiled there like a serpent. She leaned down, her trembling fingers tracing the underside of the wheel structure. The brake cables hadn't frayed naturally from wear and tear. They had been cleanly, deliberately notched with a pair of heavy wire cutters. The right wheel jerked unpredictably whenever she attempted to navigate even the slightest incline, such as the wooden ramp Walter had built leading down to the front porch. The implication was crystal clear, and it terrified her to her very marrow. They weren't just waiting for her to die anymore. They were actively setting the trap. The next morning, the air in the kitchen was thick and suffocating. Candace stood at the porcelain kitchen sink, her back turned to Evelyn, pretending to wash a stack of dishes. Without turning around, her voice cut through the silence of the house. Casual, airy, and entirely devoid of human warmth. You really should try to enjoy some fresh air out on the porch today, Evelyn. The weather report says it might be your very last warm day before the next big winter storm rolls through. Go sit by the ramp. Enjoy the view. Something in Candace's tone made the hairs on Evelyn's arms stand up. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. Evelyn looked down at her lap, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the fabric of her skirt. Realizing with absolute certainty that if she went out onto that porch today, her wheelchair would fail. She would plunge over the edge of the steep concrete steps, and Ryan would collect his inheritance before the snow melted. That very same afternoon, as a biting wind began to rattle the bare branches of the peach orchard, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the farmhouse. When Ryan opened the door, he was met by a man who looked like he had been carved out of Tennessee timber. Daniel Reeves was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with calm, discerning gray eyes that seemed to look right through people. He carried himself with the quiet, unshakable patience of someone who had spent his entire adult life listening to people lie to him for a living. Officially, Daniel was a senior investigator for the Regional Insurance Underwriting Alliance. He had been dispatched to rural Tennessee to personally review a series of highly irregular, red flag inconsistencies connected to the massive, sudden increase in Evelyn Harper's accidental death policy. Underneath his calm exterior, Daniel's veteran instincts had already begun screaming the moment the file crossed his desk. In his line of work, he had seen this exact script played out too many times. Elderly policyholders, Rushed digital signatures completed from IP addresses that didn't match the home. And an unsettling, frantic eagerness from the young beneficiaries to finalize the clauses. Ryan greeted him with a nervous, hyperactive energy, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, while Candace immediately overperformed in aggressive, suffocating warmth. "Oh, an investigator? Wow, we had no idea anyone would need to come all the way out here," Candace laughed, her voice pitching higher as she offered Daniel a cup of coffee. "We just wanted to make sure Mama Eve was fully covered. You know how dangerous old houses can be for someone in her fragile condition." Daniel smiled politely, taking a slow sip of the coffee. But his eyes never stopped moving. He was trained to notice the minute details that ordinary people completely missed. He saw the faint, dark purple bruises hidden beneath the long sleeves of Evelyn's cardigan as she sat silently in the corner of the room. He noticed the agonizing, terrified hesitation before she answered even the simplest question. He saw the way her frail hands began to visibly tremble the exact millisecond Ryan stepped into her field of vision. And then, as he walked across the room to look out the window at the property, Daniel's eyes dropped to the wheelchair. It took him only a single, practiced glance at the tension of the right brake cable to confirm his darkest suspicions. The steel fibers weren't worn down. They were sharply severed. Someone had deliberately tampered with the mechanism. This wasn't an insurance policy. It was an execution plot disguised as an accident. Daniel turned back to Ryan, his voice completely level, devoid of any emotion. "I'm going to need to have a private, one-on-one conversation with your mother to finalize her verbal affidavit for the policy activation." Ryan's face instantly flushed a dark, angry crimson. He stepped forward, interposing his body between Daniel and Evelyn. "Yeah, that's not going to happen. She gets incredibly confused these days, Mr. Reeves. Doctor's orders are very strict about stress. She doesn't remember things correctly. I handle all her legal affairs." Daniel didn't flinch. He set his coffee cup down on the table with a soft, definitive thud. He looked Ryan dead in the eye, his gaze turning to absolute ice. "Then I suppose we can wait, and the county sheriff can sit in on the conversation with us tomorrow morning. I'm sure he'd love to learn more about your administrative process." The room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a ticking bomb. Ryan's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. But he said nothing. He knew he had been cornered by a professional. Later that evening, after tracking Ryan and Candace's vehicle as they left the property in a hurried, panicked rush to grab groceries and regroup, Daniel returned to the farmhouse alone. He didn't knock this time. He walked through the unlocked front door, his boots stepping softly on the hardwood, and found Evelyn sitting entirely alone in the darkness near the dying embers of the fireplace, wrapped tightly in an old quilted blanket. For the first time in months, a human being walked into that room, knelt down beside her wheelchair so they were at eye level, and asked her a simple, profoundly human question. "Mrs. Harper, are you safe in this house?" Quote, Evelyn tried to maintain her composure. She tried to maintain that fierce, old-fashioned Southern pride that Walter had always loved her for. But the sheer weight of months of systematic humiliation, terror, and absolute isolation collapsed all at once inside her chest. A choked sob broke from her throat, and scalding tears streamed down the deep channels of her face. She reached out, her frail, trembling fingers gripping Daniel's strong forearm with a desperate, life or death strength. "I think," she whispered, her voice cracking with a terrifying realization, "I think my own boy wants me gone. I think they're going to kill me, Mr." Daniel listened with absolute, unbroken quiet as Evelyn poured her heart out. She described the locking of the door from the outside, the withheld pain medication, the threats screamed in the dark, the forged documents, and the broken brakes on her chair. But then, her voice softening, she began to speak about Walter. She spoke of the old peach orchard outside, the small Pine Ridge church by the rushing river where they had married, and the heavy military medals Walter had kept tucked safely away in the dusty attic. As she spoke the words Pine Ridge Church, Daniel's entire expression changed. A sudden, powerful shockwave of recognition rippled across his face. He stared at the weeping woman before him, his mind racing back decades into his own past when Daniel was only 10 years old. His father had been killed in a horrific, instantaneous factory accident in Knoxville, leaving his mother completely broke, devastated, and unable to afford food or heating oil for the winter. Daniel vividly remembered a kind, beautiful woman from Pine Ridge Church who had driven an old truck out to their shack every single week, bringing massive, warm casseroles, groceries, and paid heating vouchers without ever asking for a single dime or a word of praise. That woman had been Evelyn Harper. "You," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "You're the reason my mother survived that winter. You saved us." Evelyn stared at him through her tears, her eyes widening in profound shock as the past collided beautifully with the terrifying present. And in that singular, electric moment, for Daniel Reeves, the case completely ceased to be a professional assignment. It became deeply, fiercely personal. Daniel knew that to destroy monsters like Ryan and Candace, he couldn't just have suspicions. He needed undeniable, bulletproof evidence that would withstand the most aggressive defense attorneys. Over the course of the next grueling week, working in absolute secrecy and with the emergency, late-night approval of the county sheriff, Daniel began fighting back, under the guise of conducting mandatory structural insurance assessments of the historic farmhouse. He systematically installed high-definition, pinhole recording devices and hidden microphones throughout the common areas, the kitchen, and outside Evelyn's bedroom door. The resulting data stream was a sickening testament to human depravity. The hidden cameras captured footage of Ryan standing over his mother's wheelchair, his face contorted with a demonic rage, screaming at her at the top of his lungs because she refused to press her thumb onto a digital deed transfer pad. The audio monitors caught Candace sitting at the kitchen table, casually sipping tea while calculating the exact timeline of accidental death payouts over her cell phone with a coworker, laughing about how they would spend the money in Florida. But the most devastating, horrifying piece of evidence came 3 nights later. A massive, historic snowstorm rolled across the ridges of Tennessee, completely coating the rural roads in thick, black ice and cutting off the farmhouse from the rest of the county. Daniel was sitting in his truck a mile down the road, monitoring the live video feed on his laptop, when an emergency audio alert pinged his system. Inside the farmhouse, a violent confrontation had erupted. Evelyn had discovered Candace searching through Walter's old desk for the physical property title. When Evelyn had tried to wheel herself away to stop them, Ryan had snapped. The video monitor showed a terrifying scene. Ryan violently grabbing the handles of Evelyn's wheelchair and tipping it backward with shocking, brutal force, sending the elderly woman crashing heavily onto the floor, where she lay crying out in agony. Daniel didn't hesitate. He slammed his truck into drive, the tires spinning wildly on the ice as he radioed the sheriff's department, his voice cutting through the static with a lethal urgency. "Get units to the Harper estate immediately. They're going to kill her tonight." Quote, when Daniel arrived at the farmhouse, the building was dark, save for a single flickering light on the lower level. The wind howled through the peach trees like a dying animal. He didn't wait for backup. He kicked the front door open with a resounding boom, his flashlight cutting through the shadows of the living room. He didn't find Evelyn in her bed. He didn't find her in the parlor. Instead, he followed a faint, muffled, heartbreaking sound of crying that seemed to be emanating from deep within the architectural belly of the house. He walked down the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, until he stood before a small, cramped utility closet located directly beneath the basement stairs. A place where Walter had used to keep old paint cans, toxic chemicals, and cleaning supplies. The heavy wooden door was locked from the outside with a thick iron latch. Locked inside that pitch-black, freezing closet, trembling violently from hypothermia, sheer terror, and the pain of her injured hip, was Evelyn. Ryan had dragged his own mother across the floor and locked her away in the dark for hours for daring to defy him. Candace was standing in the kitchen just feet away, entirely unfazed, holding the deed paperwork and a pen, while Ryan stood outside the closet door, pounding his fist against the wood, his voice a hoarse, desperate roar. "You sign the papers tonight, old woman, or you can rot in there. Nobody is coming for you. You're going to die in the dark." Quote, the front door exploded inward for a second time as sheriff deputies, their sirens wailing in the distance, stormed into the hallway behind Daniel, their weapons drawn. "Sheriff's Department, get on the ground. Do it now." Quote, Candace froze instantly, the paperwork slipping from her numb fingers and scattering across the floor like giant snowflakes. Ryan, blinded by a sudden, animal panic, lunged away from the closet and attempted to sprint out the back door. But as his boots hit the icy porch steps, he lost his footing completely, tumbling violently down the concrete stairs before 3 heavy deputies pinned him face down into the freezing snow, slamming the steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Daniel ignored the chaos. He rushed to the utility closet, violently throwing open the latch, and dropped to his knees. He reached into the darkness, pulling Evelyn's shivering, fragile body out into the light, wrapping her tightly in his own heavy winter coat. As she clung to him, weeping uncontrollably, she looked past his shoulder to see her son being dragged away in chains through the snow. And for the very first time in years, Evelyn Harper watched someone choose her over her abusers. She was no longer invisible. The criminal trial that followed 3 months later shook the entire rural county to its absolute core. The small, historic courthouse was packed to maximum capacity every single day, with neighbors, church members, and strangers from neighboring towns lining up at dawn to witness the proceedings. The state prosecutors left absolutely no room for doubt. They systematically presented the mountain of undeniable evidence Daniel had gathered. The crystal-clear hidden camera recordings. The forged signatures analyzed by handwriting experts. The forensic data from Candace's work computer showing she had researched specific accidental death payout clauses more than 50 times. And the terrifying audio of Ryan screaming through the utility closet door. But the most profoundly devastating, emotionally shattering moment of the entire trial arrived when Daniel Reeves took the witness stand. He sat before the jury, a man of immense stature and quiet dignity, and he did not speak merely as a detached, professional insurance investigator. He spoke directly from the heart. As the son of a destitute widow whom Evelyn Harper had saved from starvation decades prior. "This woman," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intense pitch, his eyes locking onto the jury members, "spent her entire life protecting the people of this valley. When my family had nothing, she brought us warmth, she brought us food, and she gave us back our dignity. And the people who should have protected her, the boys she gave life to, instead hunted her inside her own home like an animal for profit." By the time Daniel stepped down from the stand, several members of the jury were visibly weeping. The defense didn't even attempt a cross-examination. The deliberation took less than 45 minutes. Ryan Harper was found guilty on all counts, including attempted felony murder, insurance fraud, and elder abuse. The judge, a stern man who had known Walter Harper years ago, sentenced him to 12 years in a maximum security state penitentiary, stating that his actions were a biological betrayal of the highest order. Candace was sentenced to 9 years for her role as the administrative architect of the plot. Strict, permanent protective orders were issued, ensuring that neither could ever attempt to contact or legally approach Evelyn again for the rest of their natural lives. Spring arrived slowly but beautifully to the valley after the dark theater of the trial finally concluded. The heavy snows melted away, feeding the rushing creek, and for the first time in nearly 5 years, the historic peach trees behind the old farmhouse erupted into a magnificent, vibrant canopy of soft pink blooms. The air smelled of sweet earth and renewal. The isolation that had nearly claimed Evelyn's life vanished overnight. The community rallied around their matriarch with a fierce, protective devotion. Mrs. Delaney arrived almost daily, not with excuses, but with tools to help repair the property. Members of the Pine Ridge Church spent an entire weekend completely rebuilding and widening the wooden porch ramp that Walter had crafted, ensuring it was structurally flawless and entirely safe. Children from nearby farms began visiting on weekends, sitting on the grass while Evelyn sat in her chair, finally telling them stories of the old days. And every single Sunday afternoon, without fail, a large, broad-shouldered truck would pull up the graveled driveway. Daniel Reeves would step out, carrying heavy bags of groceries and fresh supplies that Evelyn never explicitly asked for, but always deeply appreciated. They would sit together on the expansive front porch for hours, talking about his mother, about Walter, and about the future. One evening, just as the sun began to dip below the smoky blue rim of the mountains, spilling a warm, golden-purple light across the blooming orchard, Evelyn sat on the porch wrapped in Walter's old olive-drab army blanket. She listened to the gentle rustle of the wind through the peach leaves and the distant, comforting sound of neighbors laughing down the road. She took a deep, clear breath of the mountain air. For the first time in a very long time, the old farmhouse no longer felt haunted by greed, terror, or shadows. It finally felt like home again.